Perek Aleph of the Even Shelaima. And let's see where we were exactly. Yep, I think we're up to Tes. That's Perek Aleph, Sif Tes. And again, everything in the Even Shelaima is taken from something the Gra said somewhere else, usually not in the exact words. So these are paraphrases, these are not exact quotes. And this is brought from the commentary of the Gra on Tes Zion, Tuf Zion. That does not mean Tudat Zehut, which is in modern Israel, but this is the Sefer Tikkunei Zohar. You know, the Zohar is not a single book. You know, we're coming up with Lag BaOmer, and I'm not going to go over the controversies or the Shitas. Is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai the author of the Zohar, or is the Zohar Moshe de Leon? Again, it was Makubal among our Gedalim that it is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. But the Zohar itself is not a single book. Actually, there are separate kuntrasim within the Zohar itself. There's the Safra Ditzniasa, right? There's Yenuka. There is the Idra Rab and Idra Zuri. These are separate books that were put together in the Zohar. And that's why the emes is the whole Shaila of Shimon Bar Yochai may have to be reformulated. In other words, when you say the Zohar is from Shimon Bar Yochai, well, what part of the Zohar? Maybe it's this part and not that part. So in addition to the Zohar, there is something called Tikkunei Zohar. Why is it called Tikkunei Zohar? It's called Tikkunei Zohar because it has 72 tikkunim, rectifications, that emerge from the first pasuk of Bereshis. Essentially, it's 72 extended commentaries on the first pasuk of Bereshis to be masakin the world in various ways. So it's called Tikkunei Zohar. There's also a third chelek that's called Zohar Chodosh, the new Zohar. So when you think about new Zohar, what does that mean? A new Zohar, like somebody wrote a Zohar later? Well, the emes is the Ramchal actually was planning on writing a new Zohar, but that's not what we're talking about. A new Zohar just means it was published later, meaning to say part of the Zohar was published and part of the Zohar remains unpublished. It got published later, so it's called Zohar Chadash, but it's just as old as the Zohar Yashan. So the Tikkunei, so as I mentioned, as you know, the Vilna Gaon wrote a number of commentaries on Kabbalah. In fact, if you actually look at the words that the Vilna Gaon himself wrote, he wrote more on Kabbalah than on Halacha. And he didn't write a commentary on the whole Zohar, but two halakim of the Zohar, we actually have a biur from the Gra himself. One is the Safra Ditzniasa, which literally means the book of the modest, which is about Moshe Rabbeinu. And the other is Tikkunei Zohar. So you can actually get a Perish Hagra on Tikkunim. For those of you that are into Kabbalah, I don't know if anyone here learns Tikkunei Zohar, but I noticed in the Sfarim store that they put out now a new edition of Tikkunei Zohar in Be'er Hagra with kind of like a Kahati-like explanation. So it's kind of to explain Sifrei Kabbalah, you know, in simpler Hebrew. So you can actually get, now, because Tikkunim are very big, the only chelik that came out covers like Tikkunim Aleph to Chaf, which means there'll be another 53 that remain to be discovered. So be it as it may, most of the Tikkunei Zohar is totally inaccessible. By the way, if you look in Nefesh HaChaim, you'll actually see a lot of the quotations from the Zohar are from the Tikkunei Zohar. The Tikkunei Zohar is quoted very, very much in Nefesh HaChaim and the like. Now, most of the Tikkunei Zohar and most of the Gra's commentary on Tikkunei Zohar is totally beyond us. But every once in a while, the Gra will be mitzi from a big, intricate Kabbalistic discussion, certain inyanim of Midos and Musar and Derech Eretz, which the Mechaber of Even Shelaima will kind of extract. So here's an example, one example of many. We're going to see many examples of something b'derech nigla, a revealed teaching that was extracted from the Gra's Perush on Tikkunei Zohar, and that simply says, very short, Kol hatovos v'haraos bi'olam hazeh, hakol al pi harov lefi hamidas. All of the good and all of the bad that happen in this world, usually, so he's not saying it's 100%, al pi rov, most times, lefi hamidos, it is because of midos. Now, as simple as this sentence sounds, it actually is ambiguous. There are two different things it could mean. One might be a practical meaning, and the other might be a more ethereal, mystical meaning. Now, maybe, since it's from the Kunei Zohar, by definition, you'd favor the mystical meaning. But let's see. The practical meaning, which is emes, is that most of the tsaros in the world come because of bad midos. In other words, that's a mitziastic thing. People fight, people disagree, people are selfish, people are egotistical, people bear grudges. Wars get started because people take offense. In other words, it's a practical statement. The churbanos that occur in Olam Hazeh are because of bad midos. If people would have good midos, you just wouldn't have these problems. Which means, according to that definition, tovos and ra'os refer to human relationships, meaning to say there are going to be good human relationships when there's midos tovos, and there'll be all sorts of destruction when there's midos ros, and that's a practical thing. Midos tovos or ros determine the quality of life in society. Now that's a very, very simple observation. Now, which means, in other words, when the Gra mentions tovos and ros, he's not talking about tsunamis, he's not talking about hurricanes, he's not talking about buildings collapsing, he's simply talking about the things that get caused because of animosities between people. But it's shayach that this is also a more mystical idea, that even those inyanim that do not have a logical causative relationship with bad midos, like a tsunami happens, or an earthquake happens. Well, bad midos, b'derech hateva, do not cause earthquakes or tsunamis. But what the Kunei Zohar was saying is, in ruchnius it does cause it, meaning to say, the things that happen in Olam Hazeh are gebait on midas. You see what I'm saying? There are two ways of understanding it. If tovos and ros refer to interpersonal conflicts, then it's simply making a statement that bad midos or good midos either create harmony or create disharmony. But if he means in ruchnius what happens in Olam Hazeh is makusher to midas, even if there's no logical connection, then it's a more mystical idea. Now the emes is, the Meshech Chochma, I don't think he brings, although Rav Meir Simcha, by the way, knew Kabbalah very, very well. Rav Meir Simcha, again, I don't know if you're going to call him a Makobel, but certainly just as he knew Bavli and Yerushalmi, he also knew Zohar and Kabbalah, so he was involved in everything. But I don't think he quotes, in this context, the Kunei Zohar. But I remember in the Meshech Chochma, he actually says an interesting thing. If you look at Parshas Ekev, one of many actually, it says, if you keep Hashem's mitzvos, right, so he'll give you all sorts of Olam Hazeh types of things. You'll be blessed with fertility, you'll be blessed with health, you'll be blessed with wealth. And the famous kasha that people ask is, l'chayra, how could that be? Chazal themselves say that the ikar reward for mitzvahs is in Olam Haba. Olam Hazeh is not a makom of mitzvahs. The Torah says if you do mitzvahs, you get reward in Olam Hazeh. That's what it says, Olam Hazeh. So there are different terutzim that are given, but the Meshech Chochma is mechalek between bein adam lachaveirei and bein adam lamakim. When you do mitzvahs that are serving Hashem, so of course there's going to be a reward, but that reward is Olam Haba. That reward is not Olam Hazeh. But bein adam lachaveirei, there's a midah keneged midah. Because if I treat people in a good way with midos tovos, bein adam lachaveirei, so the midah keneged midah is, just as I made somebody else's life pleasant, Hashem is going to make my life pleasant. So it actually fits in that the good that happens to you in Olam Hazeh is because of your midos tovos, and the bad that happens to you in Olam Hazeh, al pi rov, he says, is because of midos ros. In other words, the bein adam lamakim is primarily dealt with in Olam Haba and Gehenna. the bein adam lechavero is actually dealt with in Olam Hazeh. So that actually fits exactly the Meshech Chochma's idea that l'gabe good midos tovos bein adam lechavero, there is going to be a reward in Olam Hazeh because that's a bechina of midah keneged midah. And again, and that's indeed, the Mishnah in Peah could be saying that as well, although it doesn't totally fit. The Mishnah in Peah that we say every morning after Birchas HaTorah. So what do we say? Elu Devarim, Sha'adam Eichel Pereisehem Bi'olam Hazeh, V'akeren Kayemes Lo Li'olam Haba. Right? There are certain mitzvahs in which you get the income or the fruit, the interest, even in this world, and there's still a principle that you'll get in Olam Haba. So, Peresei Olam Hazeh means you'll get some schar in Olam Hazeh, even though it doesn't take away the Olam Haba. It's like Peres and Keret. So what does it say? Kibud Aviyim, Gemilos Chasadim, Sesavar Ben Adam Lechavere. But then the list is still a little short. Hashkamas Beis HaMedrash, Shachris V'Arvis. Right? Staying or getting up or staying late in the Beis HaMedrash. I assume that means to learn, not just to stay in the Beis HaMedrash. Shachris in the morning and Arvis. That sticks out a little bit because I would tend to think that's a Bein Adam Lamakim. Then what does it say? Hachnasas Orchim, very good. Bikur Cholim. Hachnasas Kala. Hava'as Shalom. Bein Adam Lechavera. Right? Making peace between people. Then it says, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. So, Talmud Torah is also described as something in which you get Pereisehem B'olam Hazeh V'akeren Kayemes Lo Li'olam Haba. So it's a bit of a tzarachi, and you have to think about this. Most of the list is Taka Bein Adam Lechavera. So most of the list actually fits what the Gra is saying here, and it fits what the Meshech Chochma says. The two that do not, and maybe that's why the Gra says Al Pi Rov, the two that do not are Talmud Torah, and it's almost the same thing. In fact, what's the difference? Hashkamas Beis HaMedrash, Shachris V'Arvis is in the list, and Talmud Torah is in the list. Just in terms of pshat, right? We say it every day. Like, what is, it's a Mishnah. What is the difference? What is Hashkamas Beis HaMedrash, Shachris V'Arvis? Does it mean for Tefillah B'tzibor, you're like the Asara Rishonim? It's referring to davening? Well, usually, when Chazal use the word Beis Medrash, see, today we call everything a Beis Medrash, but when Chazal use the Beis Medrash, they usually don't mean a place where you daven. A place where you daven, they refer to as Beis Knesses. So a Beis Medrash is kimat miyuchad for learning. So I'm just asking, I don't have a good answer. I'm asking in terms of pshat, what is the difference between Hashkamas Beis HaMedrash, Shachris V'Arvis, and Talmud Torah? Unless the pshat is, that's like an additional madrega on Talmud Torah, meaning any Talmud Torah, you have Perisayim B'olam Hazeh, V'akeren Kayemes, Li'olam, well, that's true for any Talmud Torah. And then there's another madrega on top of the Talmud Torah that you make an effort to come, 7 o'clock in the morning to learn a half an hour before davening, etc. So it could be it's just another madrega of Talmud Torah, although the emes is, that's a shver pshat, because once you start superimposing madregas, you can do it with everything. Oh, hachnasas orchim. If you give the guy, bread and water, that's one madrega. And you give the guy steak, the Mishnah is not meisif different madregas in the same mitzvah. Otherwise, you can keep on going with a million madregas. All right, so I have to be mayan taka. Look at the pshat is it. But be it as it may, putting that aside, what's the difference between the two? The kasha is, but they are not fundamentally bein adam lechavero. They're bein adam lamakim. So it could be that that's why the Gra says al pi rov, meaning most of the time it's bein adam lechavero, midos that determines these things. But there may be a few things that even you'll get in olam hazeh, even though they're not bein adam lechavero. The alternative might be well, this may be a teres v'ashkamas based on medrash, that it could be that when you show up early to learn, you become a positive hashpa on other people that are there. So that's ke'ilu ben adam l'chaveirei. But that wouldn't explain Talmud Torah, which implies even if you're by yourself and you're learning. Okay, so something to think about in that way. And this is taken from the, as I say, from the Tikkunei Zohar, and just a little word, bibliographical word. You'll see that if you wanted to look it up, at least in mine, I don't know, does it say Kuf Tes Amid Aleph? So that would depend. You have to know, because not all Zohars have the uniform Tzura Sadaf. So often in Tikkunei Zohar, they refer to the Tikkun number, Tikkun Chav, Tikkun Chavav. I don't know what Tikkun this is. But the standard Zohar, once again, was a Vilna Zohar. So even in Zohars that don't follow the Defus Vilna, they'll put on the side where the Vilna pages change, right? So it may be in an Oz V'Hadar Zohar, and there is an Oz V'Hadar Zohar, by the way. This might be Daf, Reish Lamed Beis, because they have so many commentaries and the like, but it'll say on the side in small letters, Kuf Tes or something like that. So you need to know how to find these things. Okay, so now let's go weiter with Os Yud. Yesh Minei Pechisus Biyadam. Right? There are certain deficiencies in people. All of us have deficiencies, chesreinos, in our midas. Shenitzel mehem al yidei asiyas hamitzvos. That sometimes the or, the light, the bracha, the shefa that comes by doing certain mitzvahs can rectify the pachisos, the defect of the neshama. And those mitzvahs alone can sometimes rectify the chisaron of a person's neshama. V'yesh she'enai nitzel mehem rak b'Torah levad. And there are some types of defects that a mitzvah is not strong enough. It's like a deeper sickness, right? Certain sicknesses can be cured with relatively weaker medicines. You have a cold. And certain sicknesses, you need stronger medicines. So he's saying there are certain pechisos hanefesh that mitzvahs can heal, and there are certain pechisos hanefesh that only Torah can heal. Torah is a stronger medicine. V'yesh, but then there's a third category, she'eno nitzel mehem rak imraya la'asher hamidais al yedei teichachas musar lahafrish derachav hatayvim min arayim, that you can only heal by correcting your midas through the teichacha, the rebuke of musar, to separate your good ways from the bad ways. And you'll see that this is from the commentary on Mishlei, Chaf Beis Pasuk, and the Likutim to the famous Agadah. The Likutim are little notes of the Gra on Rabba Bar Bar Chana. Right? You know the Agadah, I don't know if you learned it. Rabba Bar Bar Chana is in the 5th perek of Bava Basra. And there's amazing like stories. Lahavdil, one would look at them as tall tales, like amazing things. At one time he was on an island, and it turned out that the island was actually some gigantic animal that turned over, all sorts of maisim like that. And the whole machlokes among the meforshim is, are these literal things? Are these symbols? Are they metaphors? So the Gra has a beautiful perush on the Agadata of Rabba Bar Bar Chana, showing that these are ramazim for deeply spiritual ideas. Some of you might be familiar with Rav Aaron Feldman's sefer. It's been a long time. The Juggler and the King. The Juggler and the King is, by and large, an adaptation of the Perish Hagra on the Agadatas of Rabba Bar Bar Chana. So you can look at that book and you can see at least a simplified example of the Gra going through all of those things. Now, the pasuk in Mishlei that the Gra is commenting on is actually a very famous pasuk. Ki ner mitzvah v'Torah or V'derech chayim tochachos musar. It's a pasuk in Mishlei. So let's go over the pasuk again. Ki ner mitzvah. A mitzvah is like a candle. V'Torah or, and the Torah is like light. V'derech chayim tochachos musar. And the rebuke of Musar is the road that takes you to life. By the way, that's why the Maral called his Perish and Perkei Avos Derech Chayim, because Perkei Avos is Musar, Derech Chayim Tochachos Musar. So the Gra is masber that a candle gives light, but a candle is weaker than light. Light is the whole natural light, the whole daytime. So ner mitzvah, mitzvos are a weaker light, that doing mitzvahs could be mesakein certain bechisus hanefesh. The Torah is like ohr, that's much more powerful. But then, sometimes the only way you'll get life is by consciously focusing on a musar and tikkun hamidos. Now, in some ways, this is a bit of a enigmatic teaching, because he doesn't tell you how do you know what you're facing. He says some things are cured with mitzvos, and some things are only cured with Torah, and some things you need conscious and direct musar. Okay, that's great. Tell me which ones are which. What do I need? It doesn't say really. So that's going to be a bit of a problem. But let me just explain in a general way that this is an extremely, extremely important, as short as it is, this is an extremely important teaching, and certainly the Mechaber of Even Shelaima, Rav Shmuel Malson and his son Rav Yitzchak Malson, meant something very, very definite in bringing this in, as they will with the next one as well. And that is, we talk about the Musar movement, right? Rabbi Yisrael Salanter started the Musar movement. Now, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter lived in the middle and end of the 19th century, 1800s. This was after the death of the Gra. In fact, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is in the Shalshelis because his Rebbe was a hidden tzaddik, Rav Zundel of Salant. It was a very hidden tzaddik. And Rav Zundel was a Talmud of Rav Chaim of Volozhin. And Rav Chaim of Volozhin was a Talmud of the Gra. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was very connected to the Shalshelis of the Gra, but this was after the death of the Gra. I believe Rabbi Yisrael never saw the Gra. The Gra may have still been alive when Rabbi Yisrael was born, but the Gra died when Rabbi Yisrael was young, if at all. So Rabbi Yisrael, so what does it mean you invented a Musar movement? That means what? Before Rabbi Yisrael, nobody cared about Musar? After all, first of all, what are the great Musar for him? Sharei Tshuva was written by Rabbeinu Yaina, one of the Rishonim. Mesila Shesharim was written by the Ramchal. That was certainly a generation before the Gra. Chayvas Halavavas was written before the Rambam. In fact, the Rambam is made that the Chayvas Halavavas was his father's favorite sefer. Right? So Baruch Hashem, there are a lot of Musar Sfarim after Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. But the classics that Rabbi Yisrael told people to learn were old Sfarim that go all the way back. So what does it mean? Before Rabbi Yisrael, we didn't care about Musar? We didn't care about Midos? Midos were not important? Of course Midos were important. Of course Yiras Shamayim was important. Of course Abbas Hashem. Of course Bein Adam L'Chaveru was important. Rabbi Yisrael didn't create the idea that these are important things in being a Jew, in being a human being. Elamai, but there was a belief that these are not things you have to study. They're not things you have to learn about, even though the Ramchal already said that's a big mistake, but the Ramchal identified that mistake. The Ramchal said in the Hakdama to Mesila Shesharim that a lot of people think Yiras Hashem is not something you have to work on. You do Torah, you learn Torah, you do mitzvahs, and you'll come to Yiras Hashem. Midos are not something you have to work upon. And in fact, in Volozhin itself, in fact, it is said that in Volozhin, they didn't even learn Nefesh HaChaim, which was written by Chaim Volozhin, because Volozhin had a shita that Torah itself will give you everything you need. So, surprisingly enough, and I think I've mentioned this before, When Rabbi Yisrael Salanter tried to institute the notion of studying Musar, studying Midos, working on yourself, finding exercises, creating vadim, there were kama v'kama gedalim, who said they felt that that was bittul Torah, that was taking people away from learning. They also accused him of incorporating modern ideas of psychology into Yiddishkeit and the like. And they actually opposed him. I think I mentioned before that there was like a 5 or 6 volume set of svarim. It's out of print. I have not seen it around in a long time, called Tenuas HaMusar, the Musar movements, by Rav Dov Katz. And he gives beautiful, beautiful big biographies with maisim of all of the great Gedolei Musar, Rabbi Yisrael, and then the Alter of Kelm, and the Alter of Nevardik, and the Alter of Slobodka. Like, each thing, well, Rabbi Yisrael is like 500 pages, but then the other ones are, 100 pages of each of these people. He includes the Chavetz Chaim, although the Chavetz Chaim was Lav Davka, kind of officially part of the Musar movement, and the like. And he can, has all sorts of beautiful, beautiful stories. A lot of the famous stories that people say about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter are really from the Tenuas HaMusar. He documented all of these things. So Tenuas HaMusar is, I believe, was printed in 5 volumes. But I remember when I was in Yeshiva, we heard there was a 6th volume that was not really distributed that much. Only a small amount was printed. It was called Pulmus HaMusar. Pulmus means the fight against Musar, in which Rabbi Katz gathered together newspaper articles from the time and different hakrazos and different condemnations and different criticisms against Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and his Talmidim, in which sometimes it was Gedolim Mamish who came out against it, and sometimes it was yeshiva guys that were doing rioting and stuff. It's hard to believe that they would riot if you tried to introduce a Musar later and the like. And he gathered all of that together. Now, Rav Dov held that it was important for people to be aware of these things and not to repeat them, but he didn't want to, it's kind of strange, he didn't want to be mefarsim it too much. So it was like very, very limited printing. So, of course, that's the book we all wanted to read. He says, where are you going to find Pulmus HaMusar? Where are you going to find it? So eventually, Chazal say, Yogati Umatsasi, you work hard, you find. So, Be'ezus Hashem, we were Zeicha to find a Pulmus HaMusar. Very, 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 very interesting. Again, as I say, some opposition to Rabbi Yisrael came from Gedolim Mamish, and some opposition came from guys who were just misbehaving in some serious ways. In fact, the emes is, some of the maisim that are reported are frankly very, very unbelievable. B'nai Torah seemed to be much tougher in those days. I mean, Reb Eliezer Gordon was the founder of the Telzer Yeshiva, the Yeshiva in Tels. Very, very chashuv a person, a gadol. And although he himself was not Musar was a new thing, it was not the thing that he grew up with, but he realized that the new generation needed Musar. So in Tels, he hired Rabbi Yehuda Leib Chasman, who later became Mashgiach of Hebron here. Really, that was one of the great Baalei Musar, and he made him Mashgiach over the yeshiva to give Sichos Musar and Tikkun Midos and the like. So the older Bachrim were so offended with the idea that they thought imposing Musar on them was like treating them like kindergartners. It says, we're adults, we're B'nai Torah, we learn, we know how to learn, we don't need some guy, I hate to talk this way, with a gray beard, telling us we have to, be nicer to each other. So what they did was, in the middle of a shmooze by Reb Leib Chasman, they kind of extinguished the lights. This is before electricity, and they kind of put him in a bag. They put a bag over him, and they tied him up, and they threw him out of the beis medrash. I mean, this is unbelievable. I really have difficulty. I can't explain this at all. Like, how could you do that? But that's what they did. When Rabbi Eliezer Gordon heard what happened, he was ready to. He said he was going to close the whole yeshiva. He says he doesn't need a yeshiva. Hashem doesn't need a yeshiva where people behave that way. He was going to close it. He was convinced to keep it open. I think that the real troublemakers he expelled, but whatever. He himself gave shreklich Musar to the Talmidim. But Lamaiser, Leib Chasman left. He left else. He went somewhere else. It wasn't the place that he felt comfortable teaching it. It was mamish pikuach nefesh kemat, whatever it would be. But here is the thing. If somebody does this because they think they don't need Musar, that's the biggest raya in the world. They need Musar. That proves the point. The gaiva, the azas, the being mavazeh talmid chacham. You say you don't need Musar. You're showing by your whole behavior. It reminds me, l'havdil of another mashal. The Pope, I think the last Pope, at one point made a statement that too many Muslims are involved in violence. So in protest, a bunch of Muslims burnt down a church. Now, is that a refutation of what the Pope said? It's a raya, It's mamish the same thing here. We don't need Musar. Our Midos are fine. We're going to put you in a bag and throw you out of the building, right? So, at the time of the Even Shelaima, when it was published, this was a real controversy. There were those who said Torah alone is all you need, and there were those that said you need Tikkun HaMidos. So we already see in the Gra, this is what the Gra is being merames to. Before, much earlier, the Gra is being merames that there may be a certain pechisus that Torah helps, but it's not going to help for everything. You need sometimes to consciously work on Midas Torahs. Now, the way the Chavetz Chaim put it, the Chavetz Chaim said two things about Musar. He said, number one, any yeshiva that does not have Musar is like a bor birshus harabim. That's an interesting mashal. Right, a bore, right? Someone digs a pit in a public place. So what does the Torah say? People who fall, get injured, you're chayav to pay. You're a mazik. So the Chavetz Chaim is saying, to send Talmidim out into the world who may know a lot of Torah, but they didn't work on Midas Tovos, you're creating obstacles. Look at the rabbis you're sending out, the teachers you're sending out. It is a bor b'rshus harabim. You're being machshel the rabbim. How many Jews are going to be turned off because of a lack of midos of their teachers or their rebbes or whatever it is? So the Chavetz Chaim says, how can you have a yeshiva without Musar? It's a bor b'rshus harabim mamish. The second thing the Chavetz Chaim said was, which again, is really, you can almost look at it as a commentary on the Gra. And that is, he says, Torah is the perfect diet for a healthy soul. Right? A person is healthy, Baruch Hashem. So in order to stay healthy, you have to have a balanced diet, whatever it is, the carbohydrates and the protein and the fruits and the vegetables, whatever it is. There's a diet that will keep you healthy. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Torah is the diet that keeps you healthy. So when your soul is healthy, Limud HaTorah will keep you healthy. But when your soul is sick, we have the same analogy as physical sickness. When you're physically sick, you need supplementary medicine to the nutrition that you're taking in. So the Chavetz Chaim said it could be in Friya Dikaderes, where people might have been healthier in that sense spiritually. Torah is all they needed. But in our door, so many taivas, so many pressures, so many yetzer haras, and every door you could define new yetzer haras. Right? Every door has new yetzer haras. So you need something more than Torah. Torah alone is a tremendously necessary diet. It is your diet. Your diet is Torah. So, if you were to say, all I'll do is Musar, that's what the Nefesh HaChaim writes about, then that's like saying, all I'll do is take medicine, I won't eat anything. Well, you'll die of starvation. So Torah is your diet. Torah is your diet, but the Musar is a necessary medicine for people that have sickness of the soul. And unfortunately, all of us have some type of sickness of the soul. So this was a live controversy about the need for Musar for B'nai Torah, and that's why this was put in here, that the Gra himself, right, all the yeshivas are machshav the Gra, right, the Gra is it. The Gra himself said that there's pechisos hanefesh that Torah will not remove, and you have to consciously do avodas HaMusar. Now, what's interesting is people think, and by the way, it's hard to understand that this was kind of like a war. This was a major, major struggle. For example, Slobodka had two different yeshivas. Slobodka started off with the yeshiva that was founded by Rav Yitzchak Ochan Inspector, who was the Kovner Rav, Slobodkin Kovners. Kovna is a big city, Slobodka is the suburb, so Kovna, Slobodka are really the same place. And the yeshiva was founded. It was called Knesses Beis Yitzchak. It was in memory of Rav Yitzchak Ochan. And that was a non-Musar yeshiva. They did not have Musar there. And there was a breakaway that became the more famous Slobodka yeshiva called Knesses Yisrael in memory of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And that's where the Alter of Slobodka came. And that became one of the most famous Musar yeshivas, producing Rav Aaron Kotler and my Rebbe, Yaakov Ruderman, and Yaakov Kamenetsky, Rebbe Chil Yaakov Weinberg, many Gedolim. And that was a Musar yeshiva. But the fighting was very, very bitter. The fighting was tremendous in the sense of different oppositions. And of course, as always the case, the Bachurim were involved in machloksim that it really wasn't their business, as I told you that story, to be involved in. So, we think now, we look back at it all, and you didn't even hear this stuff. We think, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter won, Baruch Hashem, Al Pi the Chavetz Chaim and the like. It was understood that B'nai Torah need something called Musar. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, I hate to say it this way, but he won his war. He waged this battle, L'Shem Shemayim, and Baruch Hashem, he was Minatseach. That's how we would commonly understand it. But the emes is not really true. If we have to use the military analogy, maybe it's not the best analogy. The truth of the matter is he actually lost the war. Because what he envisioned as Musar is not what we do in yeshiva. In fact, what we do in yeshiva, the anti-Musar people would have no problem with. 15 minutes to look at Mesilas Yesharim, Baruch Hashem. Do you think Gedolim were against it? The Bachrim, who knows what the Bachrim were against? I don't know what they were against, but do you think Rav Yitzchak Elchanan would be against looking at Mesilas Yesharim for 15 minutes? Surely not. So the emes is, what we call Musar is what they called, not Musar, against Musar. Because Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's Musar was actually a lot more extreme than we actually do today. It would involve maybe something like 2 hours a day, just in terms of time, a long time. And it would involve not just learning Musar, but having vadim, having people getting together, like group therapy, you discuss your chesronos. It would involve exercises, lemaisa. It was a very, very all-encompassing thing. And people were afraid that this would take away time from growing and learning and steiging and the like. So the very, very modified Musar that we have was not what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter envisioned. He envisioned something much more encompassing. Similar, although in a different way, to Hasidic yeshivas. Take a Chabad yeshiva. And again, I'm not expressing anything negative or positive either way, but a Chabad yeshiva, even a good Chabad yeshiva, will learn Chasidus around 3 hours a day. That's part of the Seder. It's part of the Seder that 3 hours of the day are Chasidus. I say Chabad because I don't believe any other Chasidus does it that way. Ger and the like, they don't do a lot of learning of Chasidus. But Chabad does, because Chabad is a philosophical system, and therefore there's a lot of stuff that they learn. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, in some ways, wanted for Musar something similar to what Chabad has for Chasidus, like you'd spend 2 or 3 hours on inyanim of Musar in different ways. And as you know, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter himself divided how you learn Musar in 2 ways. Just like Bekias and Ian, he had what's called Musar be'Ian, and he had what was called Musar be'Hispalos. He introduced a different word. Musar be'Ian is Ian. You take a sefer like Mesilas Yesharim, and you don't just learn it quickly, but you think about it, you ask yourself, how does it apply to my life? And it's an Ian, like anything else. You go through the Mamari Chazal that are quoted, you try to understand them, you try to apply them. That's called Musar be'Iyan, which is an intellectual aspect of Musar. Musar be'Hispailas is to learn Musar in a way that emotionally excites you and arouses you, meaning you feel very emotional inside. And this was primarily done almost in a mantra-like way, by taking a Maimer Chazal or taking a chelik of Mesilas Yesharim or Sharei Tshuva. Take a line, take a sentence that moves you and say it over and over and over again, just like a niggun, right? You sing a niggun many, many times, so you kind of get taken over by it. So this was called Musar b'his Pilus, and this was a very important part of his thing, because he pointed out that we often need our emotions to kind of bring us to a sense of Devekus B'Hashem. So he would divide it that way, Musar b'hi and Musar b'his Pilus, as well as Vadim and practical exercises for Tikkun Hamidos and the like. So in Kelm, for example, that's how they did it. Kelm was much more of a Musar Yeshiva than even Slobodka, because Slobodka already, see, the altar of Slobodka, it's interesting, just the planning of the yeshiva was fascinating. He was very committed to Musar. He was a Talmud of Israel, very committed to Musar, but he also wanted to make a world-class learning yeshiva environment. So, by definition, he had to compromise a little on the Musar. So in Slobodka, they didn't do hours and hours and hours, because they had to be very great in learning. Slobodka became, well, maybe I'm no Gabadav because my yeshiva is from Slobodka, but many say Slobodka was the greatest yeshiva after, Volozhin closed. After Volozhin closed, many would say, many, not everybody, but many would say Slobodka was the greatest of the Litvish yeshivas. And this was the altar who tried to have a tightrope, altar of Slobodka, between making it mamish, a gewaldige makam Torah, and at the same time, the Musar. Kelm, for example, had Musar to the highest degree, and there was learning, good learning, but Kelm was not, you wouldn't call it, I shouldn't be passing judgment, but you wouldn't call it like the highest madrega of learning, because, the Musar kind of overshadowed. So Slobodka, they tried to do the opposite. Both of them, Kelm and Slobodka, were great Musar yeshivas, but the altar modified the Musar a little bit so the learning would become more dominant. Now, one might say, if you want to be a cynic, that's why Slobodka produced Apikorsim and Kelm didn't. It's interesting, you weaken the Musar, you get a certain negative impact on that as well. Slobodka produced Gedalim, and Slobodka produced people who became famous Apikorsim. It's an interesting thing. People who, whatever, because you understand the problem. The problem is when you emphasize the intellect above everything, so you run into certain sakanas. So these were real debates. These were real issues, real debates. Like how do you balance Musar, character development, with learning be'iyun and everything else? And that's why they want to bring the Gra, right? And that's why people say that Aliba Diemes, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, is said to be the founder of the Musar movement, but really it's the Vilna Gaon that's the founder of the Musar movement, because he already spoke about the importance of direct Avodah in Tikkun Hamidos and the like. By the way, just to finish the Shalshelas here, I hope you know that Chevron is Slobodka, meaning what happened was, in the 1920s, before the Holocaust, Slobodka in Europe, in Lithuania, decided to establish a branch in Eretz Yisrael. So they established a branch in Hebron while the yeshiva was still in Europe, in Slobodka. And towards the end of that time, the altar of Slobodka actually came to Eretz Yisrael. And that's where he died. So his last few years, he was in Eretz Yisrael, but there still was the great yeshiva in Lithuania. And then, of course, was it 1928, the yeshiva in Hebron, there was the tremendous Arab massacre in which many, many of the yeshiva got killed. So because of that, the Hebron yeshiva relocated to Yerushalayim. So that would explain the anomaly of why is there a Yeshivat Hebron in Yerushalayim. The answer is it relocated after the 1928 massacre. But Hebron is indeed the Israeli branch of Slobodka. Now, in Bnei Brak, there is a yeshiva called Slobodka, not connected to Hebron at all. And that's the Slobodka that relocated after the Holocaust. In other words, when the Lithuanian yeshiva was destroyed, and they wanted to rebuild it, so they came to Eretz Yisrael, and they called it Yeshiva Slobodka. So Slobodka in Bnei Brak and Chevron in Yerushalayim come from the same mother yeshiva, but they are two independent yeshivas. Actually, I have a perfect analogy to growing up in Hartford, Connecticut. The Jewish community was in Hartford, Connecticut, but people moved to West Hartford, and they started the Young Israel of West Hartford, which was a branch of the Young Israel of Hartford. But then eventually the Young Israel of Hartford moved to West Hartford. But since they were against that first move, they didn't want to join that show, so they moved to West Hartford, and they created the Young Israel of Hartford in West Hartford. So it's the same story. So therefore, in West Hartford, Connecticut, you have the Young Israel of West Hartford, and then you have the Young Israel of Hartford. So the Young Israel of West Hartford is like Chevron, and the Young Israel of Hartford is like Slobodka and Bnei Brak. It's the same story. Okay, alrighty. So this is important that the Gra is clearly on the side of Musar, although he doesn't tell you how many hours, etc. Now, the next thing, I think I actually told you the first day that we were learning Even Shelaima, but now this is where he says it. And this is something else from the Gra, and you'll notice, if you look at the end of the paragraph, that this is a conglomeration of a number of quotes in Mishlei, Chaf Daled Lamed Aleph, Yotes Tesvav, Chaf Hey Daled. Those three different places in Mishlei. And this is quite an amazing thought and a beautiful thought. He says, Inyan HaTorah LeNefesh. What Torah does for your nefesh, and here, by the way, I don't think, well, maybe it does, because he said before, Midos are rooted in your nefesh, right? So essentially, the impact of Torah on your nefesh is dugmas hamatar la'aretz, is analogous to rain falling on soil. Torah, right, this is the famous teaching, Torah is compared to water. Now, there are a million reasons why Torah is compared to water. It purifies, it cleanses, it nourishes. But now the Gra is going to give you an amazing, different reason. Shematzmiach mashen is rabbah. The nature of water is whatever you plant in that ground, the water is going to cause it to grow. Whatever. Sam chayim o sam mavis. Whether it's things that give life or things that give death. Right? Water doesn't care if what you have is wheat, or if what you have is poison ivy, or if what you have is some plant that might be poisonous. Water is matzmiach, whatever is in the ground. Torah is like water. Therefore, what does that mean? Kain b'Torah matzmiach ma shebalibai. Whatever is in your heart, the Torah is going to make it grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. What does that mean? Im libo tov tagdil yirasei. Right, that part is not controversial. So if your heart is good, you're filled with yiras Hashem and avas Hashem and avas Yisrael and rachamim, then yeah, the more you learn Torah, the more your rachamim and your chesed and your midos are going to grow and grow and grow. Right? Everybody would agree with that. But this is the controversy. Look at this. V'im b'libai shirish paira reish v'lana. This is taken from Parshas Vayelech at the end of Devarim. If in your heart there is a root, paira, that is growing, rosh and lana are the names of very bitter herbs, meaning in your heart there's a root that'll produce bitterness and rebellion against Hashem. So what's going to happen? Yigdal hatina belibai. Tina is like the defect will get worse and worse and worse. Now, this is something that really needs a lot of hesber, meaning This is much more radical than what was said in Yud. In Yud, the preceding Sif, okay, certain sicknesses of the soul might be so severe that Torah is not going to cure them. You need work of Musar. Okay, Beseder, I need radical surgery. But Yud Aleph is saying something way, way, way beyond that. Not only will the Torah not cure, the Torah will make it worse. That's what it says. Like the water that causes the poisonous weed to keep on growing. Now, I once had occasion, I don't use this word in public anymore. I once had the occasion, I once said this at a Shabbaton, a mentor's mission Shabbaton, which is filled with a lot of people from Lakewood. And the Lakewood guy said, he doesn't believe it, it's not shayach. Well, I just read it to you. It's not shayach that the Vilna Gaon would say such a thing. It is impossible. Okay, so whatever, I don't say it because I'm too old for fights, but it says it here. It says it. Now, I admit, this is very, very schwer. Now, in some situations, I think we can hear it pretty well. Gaiva, I think, is a very good example. Let's assume a person is a Baal Gaiva. He loves to win. He loves to be combative. He loves to show up the other guy. You can hear, right? You can hear such a matzav that learning will make him more of a Baal Gaiva because it's another way I can show how smart I am. And therefore, in a way, I'll be a bigger Baal Gaiva because of my learning than I would be had I not learned. The Torah, in a sense, was makalkel me. So Gaiva, I think, is one area where we could understand how Torah potentially, alone, without Musar, again, the eighth is going to be Musar, we'll see, could be makalkel the person. Other things, less so. Would it make a person less considerate? I mean, let's assume, would it make a person meaner? Would it make a person less thoughtful of other people? Well, you have to think about this. But the Gemara is saying in Yeshivat that Torah alone, could theoretically be makalkel. Isn't this, but in terms of a brilliant interpretation, Torah is compared to water. Whatever you pour the water on, you're going to get more of. Now, look at the other raya he brings, and he explains the pasuk in Hosea, which is the pasuk of the Haftarah of Shabbos Shuvah. Tzadikim yelchu bam, the righteous walk in Hashem's ways. Uposhim yikoshlu bam, and the sinners stumble in Hashem's ways. Now, the Gra is merames that there's a kasha in this pasuk. Because we're talking about walking in the way of God. So it shouldn't say, tzaddikim walk in the way of God, and sinners trip in the way of God. Really, they're walking on a different road. Tzaddikim, just like the Chumash says, I'm giving you two ways, the derech hachayim, right? So the pasuk shouldn't say, the poshim stumble on the road of the tzaddikim. It should say, they walk on a different road. So says the Gra, wow, this is what it's saying. That a person could be walking in the same road of the tzaddik. And for him, it'll be a michshel, because his midos are bad. You see the diak. This is the diak of that pasuk. That's why it says the posheya will stumble not on a different road. He'll stumble on the road of Hashem, because the Torah will be makalkel him. That's one raya that he brings. And then he brings another raya for Gemara in Shabbos. Also it's a Gemara in Sukkah. It says like this, L'mayminim ba, to those, well, it's hard to even translate this, to those who put the Torah to their right, meaning they learn L'Shem Shemayim, Sama Dechaya, it is the medicine of life, Ulamasmeilim ba, but those who don't treat the Torah with that respect, it'll be Sama de Musa, a medicine of death. So again, the Gra's diuk is this. Torah is being described as something that's poisonous. Now, if the only problem is that Torah will not heal all the illnesses, then Torah is either good or neutral. It's not going to be poison. And yet, Chazal use a lashon that the Torah itself is a sam mavis. You see? That's not just saying it doesn't heal certain defects. That's saying you're taking poison. So these are the rayas that the Gemara brings, that it's shayach for Torah to be makalkel a person beyond what he was before he learned. So what's the eitzah? Do we tell the person, don't learn? You got bad midos, better not to learn? We certainly don't say that. But we say, if Torah is matzmiach, what's ever in the garden, then you got to be sure your garden is good. Get rid of the weeds. Get rid of the poison. Al kain, tzorich lefanais libay. You need to kind of purify your heart. B'chol yom kodem halimut. He suggests before you learn. And then he says acharav, and afterwards as well, because in case the Torah made some weeds grow, so you weed afterwards. Get rid of those weeds. May ipush is rotting of deis, of different emotional state. Deis does not mean, Hilchos Deis in the Rambam actually refers to character flaws. Midos, and yiras chet, to work on yiras chet and ma'asim tovim. And now he even says, this is interesting, Zeh mechuneh b'shem beis hakisei. This process of getting rid of the junk is described as going to the beis hakisei. And he says, okay, this is part of a longer thing, Val zeh ramzu b'mashu amru beis hakisei adifim mikulu. Okay, there's a Gemara in Brachos, maybe some of you have learned, many of you might have learned, where they're discussing like what's the best thing you can find in life. So one opinion says a shidduch, and one opinion says a rebbe, and one opinion, very pragmatically, says a bathroom, a beis hakisei. Nothing as good as that. And the Gemara says, l'maskana, beis hakisei adif mikulu. That's the best answer. The beis hakisei is the best answer. Now, eina mikriyas pshuto, pashat pshat is actually perfectly true. But the Gemara has a deeper meaning. And he says, the beis hakisei, just like going to the bathroom, right? You're getting rid of the impurities, expelling them from your body. That's what it is, right? So the same thing. The process of Musar and introspection to uproot the negative midos. When the Gemara says that's better than anything, because that's the only way your Torah is going to help you. Your Torah is not going to help you if you have not properly eliminated what needs to be eliminated, right? So again, he goes on to other Mamar Chazal. We'll finish it next time. But again, the problem is a practical problem, and that is, okay, so what do I tell a person? Maybe that person is us, me, who has bad midos. Do I tell him not to learn? I mean, what do I do? Do I say, you can't come to the yeshiva until you have better midos? However you measure that even. It's a tough one. I think we would always say, better to learn than not to learn. And yet, like this hesber, it's not so pashut. But I think the answer would be, ultimately, that you can get rid of weeds anytime you want. Meaning you say like this. Even if the weeds grow big and tall, it may be harder to get rid of them, but you can still get rid of them, and then you'll have a garden. So it could be that we still feel it's kedai to learn, because even if the Torah is making you worse right now, because the weeds are growing bigger and bigger and bigger, once we get rid of the weeds, you will have the benefit of what the Torah gave you. In other words, so it's not like the Torah is going to waste, meaning the Torah may be making you worse, but it's a type of deficit that can be masukan, you see? So that would be, I think, the cheshbon of why we would tell you to learn, even if you haven't yet worked on your midas. Okay, you have a good Shabbos, a good week.